Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
To put my cards on the table, I think that the reason this article and articles like it is appearing now would be because there's this growing Hispanic population in the US. The coalition of the ascendant is will not be televised, has not really delivered on like leftward voting as advertised, especially in the case of people from Latin America who have, traditional faith, who might actually identify with kind of classic American values like hard work. And since that is in itself, according to the Smithsonian, an actual white supremacist value, the kind of line of attack for the woke left seems like it's going to be, oh, well, don't you worry about this like massive and rapidly growing contingent of sort of vaguely off-white people who seem to be voting conservative, like they're actually white after all, or they're just trying to be white, or they're trying to be American, which means being a murderous psychopath. Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of the American Mind and associate editor at the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined this week by managing editor Seth Barron and publisher and president Ryan Williams. It has become a sort of cliche here at the Roundtable that we're constantly commenting on developing stories which manage to develop even in the time frame between when we do the recording and when the podcast drops. And this is one of those times because we are in the middle of a vote on this new debt ceiling bill. As I speak, it has passed to go to a House vote, 241 to 187, to pass the rule governing debate on the measure, setting it up for a final vote. Those that have not been following this story, there's been kind of an ongoing set of negotiations, dispute over whether to raise the debt ceiling, the amount of debt that the government can accrue, since that limit is looming immediately in the distance. And there was some question as to whether Republicans and the Biden administration and Democrats more generally could come to an agreement about what sort of deal, what demands, I guess, we had before the ceiling could be raised. This was a major point of issue in the House Speaker shenanigans a little while back, and just in the sort of new control that Republicans exert, and a certain, I guess, brand of populist Republican exerts, a certain brand of Republican with fiscal responsibility kind of central at the center of his or her concerns, as indeed, in my opinion, it should be, since we're facing what is really already a crisis, but also threatens to become a worse crisis. Here are some of the major deal points that are in this bill. If it passes, we will have a raise on the debt ceiling. We'll have a 2-year, in fact, debt suspension, which is to say that the government can basically just borrow whatever it wants, as I understand it. No limits will be there. So it's not even raising the debt ceiling exactly so much as just kind of blowing the debt ceiling off the House. There will be no cuts to the energy plan and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is another sort of Biden desideratum. And of course, the 2-year suspension means that this whole thing isn't going to come back into the public eye until 2025, which is very good for Biden. Republicans got the following concessions, if you want to call them that. Federal spending must remain flat in the fiscal year 2024. It has to stay the same for 2024 and increase no more than 1% in 2025. There will be some expanded work requirements for people receiving government aid. There will be $20 billion in cuts to the IRS, and those who owe student loan payments will have to start paying again by the end of the summer. That's one of the many sort of ongoing COVID, supposedly emergency relief packages. And that has to end if this bill passes. So back when the Republicans were sort of taking their seats in the House, we talked a lot about whether this kind of new cohort was going to represent, was going to really shake things up, was going to kind of represent the new face of the Republican Party and maybe make some of these fights and disputes more contentious. Certainly, the press was certainly making noise as if this was going to be a real nail biter. This looks to me, and I am by no means an expert in this topic, this looks to me like pretty weak sauce. I mean, it just seems like kind of business as usual. What do you guys make of this? Am I missing something dramatic here, or is this basically just kind of, we're not going to really address this problem? We're just going to keep spending, basically.
Yeah. Seems to me that every year the country undergoes a kind of amnesia about what happened the previous year, regarding the debt ceiling and the arguments about it. I mean, maybe I'm just cynical or I don't know enough about the topic, but every time this comes around, the press gets really excited about it. Both sides start threatening that older people aren't going to get their Social Security checks and veterans are going to, get unplugged from their life support machines. Maybe they start erecting barriers outside around the Washington Monument. And politicians get very enthusiastic about blaming the other side, but I've never once heard anyone comment or talk about this who isn't professionally involved in the topic. And every time it seems it's one of these dances that are performed that give each side the opportunity to generate a spectacle and then declare victory or point fingers at the other side. Maybe that's just a reductive way to look at it. I feel like if we were to look back at news articles from every year dating back decades, we would see the same thing happening. And meanwhile, the debt, keeps spiraling higher and higher, and government spending seems to keep going up. So I find it hard to get too enthusiastic or excited about it one way or the other, because it always seems to resolve in exactly the same way. And the government never defaults, and that's sort of what happens.
The government never defaults until it doesn't. Yes, I think that's until it does, rather.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, but I mean, that's very much commensurate with my experience. This sort of seems like one of those issues on which one is constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. It seems to me, and to me, an idiot, it seems impossible that we should just go on borrowing money sort of ad infinitum without consequences. It seems we already suffer some consequences and will continue to. But also, it is hard to resist the feeling of Groundhog Day. It's almost like we want the people who watch politics professionally always want something kind of catastrophic or epoch-making to be happening, and we especially want that in the summer, which is famously the silly season when actually nothing is happening. And I have definitely heard, Seth, the sort of like histrionics that you're talking about. Like, I'm stacking up gold next to my bedside because the government's going to default on its debt. And then on the other side, sort of the Republican, like, I hope the government does default on its debt just to bring home, like, how irresponsible. And yeah, it's like this upshot seems to be, I mean, maybe I'll be proven wrong and maybe this thing won't pass the House, but it seems like the upshot is sort of, well, nobody has any solutions. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing because, until it hurts worse.
Yeah, we should cast our minds back, of course, to the bigger picture of this whole thing, which is the fact that the House of Representatives, the primary engine of spending, that is spending approval, as laid out in the Constitution, all bills of revenue shall originate in the House, et cetera, has not really budgeted normally or really appropriated normally for over 3 decades. And it's not an accident that this dysfunctional, performative, fake dance that we witness now, not only at debt ceiling time, but also at, budget approval time, authorization time, omnibus spending bill time. It's this whole dysfunctional thing is the product of the fact that Congress doesn't know how to legislate anymore and doesn't know how to appropriate anymore. I want to point everyone, I've mentioned it before, but it's been maybe a year since I have. So I would just point everyone back to a Claremont Review of Books article called Nationalism, Populism, and Trumpism, I think, from Chris DeMuth. I might have those in the wrong order. But Chris makes the argument that neither, in a way, because of the way public opinion is, neither party is interested in or really can get serious about spending. There's just no political constituency for it, at least not in the way we talk about it now. So you just have to prepare for a great crisis, whether it's a currency crisis or a real debt crisis, not a fake one like we're trying to orchestrate now. Some external shock, a real depression, and then use that crisis to try to change the national opinion on this thing. And how could you blame people for not really caring about spending? I mean, watching this whole spectacle that seems performative and fake, I think, to a lot of Americans, if they're even paying attention, just shows that people in Washington are not serious, and that whether people are equipped, normal citizens are equipped to describe it this way or not, Congress is now, and has been for decades, a mere ombudsman for the administrative state. And the real game in Washington is in the bureaucracy and all of the agencies that receive mountains and gallons and deluges monthly, quarterly, annually of non-discretionary spending that they are just guaranteed. And that sort of non-discretionary spending is spending that's mandated by Congress. So Congress has to meet that obligation or somehow modify the old authorizations. And that's the bulk of our federal spending. And that really the levers of interest, influence, and largesse, and really all the levers of power for that game are no longer in Congress. They're down the street or spread across the Potomac. And so that's the crisis of modern constitutionalism in one big sense. There's a few other crises of modern constitutionalism, but that's the bigger picture. So I don't know. At this point, I just want more entertainment out of clown federal government land. So I hope they don't pass it tonight, and then we can maybe have something interesting happen, but I doubt it.
Sure, why not? I mean, I hope spaghetti falls from the sky. Yeah, I mean, this...
one last point is, this is the luxury of a decadent society that happens to find itself still in possession of the world's reserve currency. I mean, this sort of nonsense would not be possible without that.
Yeah, I mean, what greater luxury even is there than infotainment, than like sort of wishing for events to occur solely on the basis of your desire for something to watch on a Wednesday night? I mean, this is... I have a few questions about everything that you've just said, Ryan, because maybe it speaks only to my personal cast of mind or like psychological disposition, but it strikes me that not only is this one of the hardest things to make exciting or to make feel important, it's also one of the political issues where the distance between public interest and excitement on the one hand and real gravity and urgency and seriousness on the other hand, or that distance is largest. Like, it's enormously important and also fabulously boring. And just in an American political system, it strikes me that that is a deadly combination. Like, I am constantly quoting that one line from Jefferson about how debt is, public debt is the lead horseman of the team of national ruin, because it's like the one time anybody ever has succeeded in making this issue seem grave and dire and adventurous, and it took a writer of Thomas Jefferson's caliber to do it. When you compound that, add that onto that, the fact that the whole kind of apparatus system that you describe, Ryan, of sort of progressive bureaucratic capture and constitutional decay and just general sort of, if you like, systemic dysfunction, that's likely to produce in your average listener a sense of just total despair. Like, what is any individual going to do about that? And once again, we end up in a place where the sort of levers of agency are rapidly slipping out of the fingers of the individual American citizen, in whose hand it is by right supposed to rest. Like, this is sort of really fundamental to our self-conception as Americans, isn't it? That we're supposed to have some agency and decision-making power over the kind of most important things in our lives. And instead, it's like actually they're very obscure and difficult to understand. And even if you could, you probably couldn't make any sort of difference in them. That's an awfully bleak sort of picture. And I'm having a hard time sort of talking myself out of it, except to say, I suppose that there are, things that one can do personally to brace for the shock, as Ryan is saying. I don't know.
Isn't it the case that, not just that the individual American is detached from this machinery, but that Congress itself is really just serving a kind of functionary's role.
Right. The politicians, the average politician is also detached from and shut off from it.
And that this is all downstream from, the real power, wherever it is. And it's probably been this case since, 1913 or so.
Yeah.
But the idea that Congress would somehow interrupt everything, it's about as likely as saying that, oh, well, if the bank teller at the bank wanted to, he could just put all the checks in a drawer and not file them.
Right, like anybody on the plane could just pull that red lever and open the door, and we could all document. Right, those sorts of things can happen, but we just know that they won't.
Right.
Right. This does seem to me to be a good argument for sort of affirming that anybody who wants seriously to run for president or for the Republican nomination should sort of demonstrate an awareness of this problem and a kind of willingness to really to take some names on this very question and not be afraid to get called a terrorist or a fascist or whatever on that. Trump obviously had that to a certain extent with this whole drain the swamp thing, but notoriously the swamp remains. And I guess I wonder, in a second, we'll start talking a little bit about DeSantis's announcement that he will in fact be running. But do you guys think DeSantis grasps the gravity of this situation or has ideas about what to do with it?
Well, he's well acquainted with at least the way Congress is dysfunctional, having served in it and being a fairly smart guy.
Yeah.
And a spending hawk, of sorts, given our modern, given the sort of laughability of anyone being a spending hawk these days in Congress. But so that's the only, I just qualify that. DeSantis is great, smart guy. But yeah, I will push back on Seth's slander of 60 years worth of congressmen. There were still some good appropriators and serious people in Congress up into the 70s and maybe even the turn of the 80s. Just some Claremont lore we published with the Heritage Foundation in 1984, the Imperial Congress, Crisis in the Separation of Powers, which does a lot of diagnosing of this problem now. Right around 30 years ago. So you can pick up a hardcover copy for like $5 on Amazon. It's a nice little piece of political intellectual history. And I learned from John Marini when I talked to him on one of these special edition podcasts we did months and months ago, that there were even some authors in that Imperial Congress book, I've mentioned this before, who would only publish under pseudonyms because they were afraid of incurring the wrath of the way modern government was done and being sort of persona non grata in Washington. So it's pretty interesting. I will flag also, it's very obscure and hard to get, but it's an awesome little book and apparently has a cult following on the Hill amongst serious staffers who do budgets, is John Marini's The Politics of Budget Control, which sounds very dry and boring, but as only Marini could do, he puts the dysfunctions of modern congressional budgeting alongside Hegel and Tocqueville, among other things. So it's a nice little classic piece of work. And but anyway, this is we've been all over this problem for a long time. I stand corrected. Yeah. No, sorry that wasn't all a rebuttal of Seth, but no, people forget that the federal government was tiny until it really it picked up on the defense side at the beginning of the Cold War, and then it went bonkers on the domestic side with the Great Society. So, the executive...
I'll say the older I get, the more I agree with like Ezra Pound's radio broadcasts from Italy. Going on about the Lincoln and the national banks and so forth. maybe I'm just like losing it, but it's all making more sense.
Yeah. But the executive office of the president, the personnel, I mean, you could fit into like half of a floor of the old executive office building at its, in the 19 teens or even the 1930s. And that's just a different world from today.
Well, okay. Let us, in fact, discuss the event that we sort of teased last week. This was one of those ones that was happening right after we wrapped, so we kind of left it for today to talk about. We mentioned, of course, that Ron DeSantis has announced he's officially running for the Republican nomination. There's really a lot to unpack here. It's a rich text. The first thing to say about this announcement is that it took place on Twitter Spaces, hosted by Elon Musk. Elon Musk, as you know, CEO of Twitter, running this new sort of regime at Twitter devoted to free speech. Our friend Chris Rufo sort of endorsed DeSantis right as this space, I guess, began. The main thing that I have to say about my personal encounter with this space is that I was unable to get into it. And I don't think that I was alone. As I gather, there were some glitches that made it hard to sort of really get your way in or to stay in, and people got kicked off sometimes. It was the first time that I can think of that anything of this sort of consequence occurred in this platform. So, there was a lot made in the press of this having been a kind of glitch-ridden event. My sense was sort of more, my interest is more on the consequence of it as the first of its kind, because much as when Elon sort of launches a rocket and it doesn't work, all the naysayers are happy to kind of hoot and holler. And then you realize that this is somebody that's sort of trying out visionary and interesting things. I did sort of feel like, well, at least this kind of mode of conversation shows an awareness that the political landscape, the media landscape is changing, and it might be good, if at some point presidential candidates can kind of manage this in a smoother way to make Twitter kind of part of the presidential conversation, as Musk clearly wants it to be. The substance, from what I have been able to read after the fact, the substance of DeSantis's speech was about what you would expect, presenting himself basically as the winner, implicitly against Trump's loserdom, right? The sort of attempting to kind of position himself as the guy that is serious about governance, that is not going to like joke around and sort of fritter away votes. My pledge to you is this. He says, if you nominate me, you can set your clock on January 20th, 2025 at high noon. Because on the west side of the U.S. Capitol, I will be taking the oath of office as the 47th president of the United States. No excuses. I will get the job done. I think this is, just as a side note, sort of funny as a way of underscoring how serious he is, since presumably whoever wins the presidency will have to be there at exactly that time. It's if you vote for me, I will not be late to my own inauguration. But more seriously, there's no substitute for victory. He says, even my worst critics in Florida will acknowledge when I tell people I'm going to do something. I don't make promises or say I'm going to do something late. So running on his record in Florida, running as the serious guy. Were either of you able to get into this Twitter space? What did you make of the atmosphere? What do you make of this sort of, in general, predictable development, but still consequential development in the bid for the Republican nomination?
I made it in eventually when they switched it over to David Sachs hosting. There's, apparently part of the glitch was Elon's giant account interacting somehow with the amount of people signed on. I don't know. I don't think the launch, the half glitchy launch, will have much shelf life. I'm with you, Spencer. The substance was, I wish that DeSantis hadn't opened with that speech, just with a speech, because it's a little wonky for the medium. I mean, if the medium is the message, as one ad guru long ago taught us, then I think some adjustment to Twitter Spaces was in order. And, that's a learning curve with this sort of thing. I thought when DeSantis was taking questions and being fairly loose, for him anyway, it was fine. We'll see. I mean, I saw some breaking news, not breaking, but some, internal sources say that Trump is coming back to Twitter. Has anyone seen any evidence of that yet? I suppose I wouldn't have been able to miss that if that had happened. Yeah, the question of Twitter's role in this presidential race, and especially the primary, is pretty interesting to me, considering, as James would love to point out, Matt before him, digital technology was the salvation of democracy, including Twitter, when it helped elect Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
But when it accidentally helped elect Donald Trump, it was suddenly evil and needed to be controlled, and was the source of the destruction of democracy. That's the backdrop for social media, and especially Twitter's role in this election, and as the digital continues to eat most of our national politics. So that's why I'm interested in it. So in that sense, I think it was probably worth trying to do the launch, however sort of half badly executed it was on Twitter Spaces.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting, this progressive double attitude that, first of all, it's inevitable that our political program the history will march toward our sort of bureaucratic utopia. And second of all, it's good that it should do so. And then when it inevitably turns out that it was in fact not inevitable, it still remains like urgent and necessary and good. And so all of the things that were previously kind of signs of the inevitability of the great revolution then like turn into these evil obstacles. So it's like, well, it's naturally we're just marching gloriously onward into the globalist future because the internet. And then it's like, oh no, the internet is actually posing some problems for like mass homogenization and actually making it possible for populist movements to flourish. Like the internet must be an obstacle to progress. Like this is sort of a regular pattern. And just on the side of like, I am here to be entertained, which we seem to all be sort of on that page at least. Trump did kind of demonstrate his mastery of this medium in the wake of this announcement by taking to, I guess, Truth Social and publishing this, to me, absolutely bizarre, but also sort of hilarious, like parody Twitter space that included like Ron DeSantis, Klaus Schwab, Adolf Hitler, and just, any number of kind of undesirables and unworthies. I mean, it does seem as if in this respect...
And Soros, don't forget George Soros.
Oh, Soros. Yeah, George Soros. That's the kind of like logic of that categorization is itself an interesting matter. But like in this respect, Trump shows himself. Trump remains in a class of his own. Like there's just something about the register in which he's operating with these online sort of lexicons that, for good or ill, is like not what DeSantis is doing, or at least currently not what he's shown himself capable of doing. So that's one.
I did see a kind of an amusing product from the Trump camp where they had a video contrasting his announcement for his campaign with DeSantis, and in Trump's there's like a million flags and Lee Greenwood blasting and crowds cheering, and then it switches to like some glitchy Twitter screen with can we get this started? Can we so that was kind of funny. What I see going on though, I mean, in terms of the glitchiness of the announcement, I mean, that's kind of like very much the sort of thing that the media, journalists will cover, and ultimately it doesn't really mean anything. It's like the rollout of Obamacare. Remember, the website didn't work.
Right.
Well, there's bigger problems with Obamacare. What I think is very interesting about all of this, besides the internecine stuff, which I still find baleful and I wish would just stop, but I guess the way the left is talking about DeSantis, their attitude is that DeSantis could even be worse than Trump. And here's why. I've seen a bunch of articles like this. And this feeds exactly into what I've noticed in the last 40 years, which is that every Republican is an avatar of Hitler.
Yeah.
But then when the next one comes, we see that the old one actually wasn't so bad after all.
Of course.
So Goldwater was Hitler, but then when Nixon came around, it was like, well, Goldwater looks good compared to this, and then just iterate that up to the present. So I see all these things about how all the reasons why DeSantis is actually worse than Trump because he's so much slicker and so much more capable and he's so hateful. But then I kind of imagine, well, I guess they would then play the same thing. But the one thing worse than DeSantis would be Tim Scott. And even worse than Tim Scott, Mike Pence. So you can just keep going. Whatever. I don't know. I guess we'll see how this plays out. Trump is obviously, I don't see him, backing down and playing the kingmaker and the elder statesman like so many people have, hoped he would.
Yeah.
It looks like we're in for a really brutal, bloody contest.
Right.
And I don't know who would profit from that, basically. It doesn't seem like, I don't see it as being good for our side.
I mean, it's kind of what you're saying, Seth, is another good example of what happens when nobody can remember more than 5 minutes ago. Is because the Hitler trick keeps working only because a certain brand of gullible Republican will be like, yes, well, I agree that that's beyond the pale. Like, think that then their guy is going to be like less Hitlerian in the eyes of the left, and they'll gain a strange new respect and blah, blah, blah. And all that ever happens, right, is the next guy that shows any promise at all is actually worse because he's effective or because he's whatever, like he hates trans disabled black communists or something. Like there is just a real, like we're like, I forget which Peanuts character it is that Lucy's always yanking the football away from, but we're like that character. Charlie Brown. Yeah. Okay. We feel a little bit like Charlie Brown here. And this is something that Trump supporters have been saying for a while, is like, if you think that by nominating DeSantis, you're going to get kind of a fresh slate who's untouched by all the mud that has stuck to Trump, it's like that was always sort of a fool's errand. Like the reason to vote for DeSantis, if you want to vote for DeSantis, is because you think he can win. But don't think that if he does win, he won't immediately become. He already has become like the Franco of Florida, the whatever, the Mussolini of Middle America. So
the Hitler of Hialeah.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks for rounding out that alliterative trio.
The Pol Pot of Palm Beach. Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, no. What have I done? I've unleashed a terrible force upon the world. Yeah, Ryan. What do you?
Oh, I was just gonna say. I've been tracking the DeSantis seems to be running a slowly ratcheting up confrontational style with Trump. I mean, he sort of left Trump more or less unnamed and alluded to the differences between him and Trump in his Twitter Spaces announcement. But now he's on the ground in Iowa and doing press gaggle here and there, and I think it'll be interesting to watch the trajectory and style and strategy and tactics of DeSantis. I think getting increasingly aggressive with Trump, and then who knows what's going to happen with primary debates. You kind of have to get everyone to agree, and I don't know. It's there's a long time between now and when would the first debate be? August, I suspect, and then the slog through the end of the calendar year and into the primary. So I think Trump has a commanding lead on paper right now with polling, but I don't know what kind of shelf life that has. I mean, DeSantis has really only been in this race for a week. And including all the obstacles that are then gone for organizing, putting a real campaign team together, letting it spend money, all that sort of stuff. Yes, they're just tooling up, is what I mean to say. I mean, they've had some teams sort of raring to go, but now they can really get after it. And that with a lot of money, that can be formidable.
Yeah, I'm curious whether DeSantis will choose to meet Trump in kind at all, or whether his strategy will be to simply maintain, just insist on playing the straight man. I can see advantages to both approaches. On the one hand, there's a good argument that Trump's kind of incorrigible refusal to be anything other than like kind of maximally to those that dislike him was a mistake, was a strategic mistake, despite how incredibly enjoyable it was for the rest of us to watch, because part of what we all want is for these kind of useless woke scolds to have their ideas put pay to and to be mocked and like mockery is an important political tool and so on and so forth. But if you're DeSantis, you might want to kind of make the case that that's all well and good until the memes run out and like suburban women don't vote for you. And then you're sort of screwed, and like nice Pepe the Frog meme now like off to the gulag with you. So that would be one very effective announcement that DeSantis could make. On the other hand, it would put him in the position of every other Trump opponent ever, which is the position of playing the straight man to his kind of irascible troll. And there's just like, it's very, very difficult to come out on top of that, especially in a primary when the people that are watching are the people that want kind of like to see somebody own the libs.
Yeah, and remember just the mechanics of a primary too. I suspect that this will not be a repeat of 2016 with so many candidates staying in for so long and Trump sort of hoovering up pluralities. I just don't quite see it playing that way. Although, and if you have enough money, you can make it to Super Tuesday, which it was pretty much over, at least in the popular imagination by Super Tuesday last time. I mean, you know, people voted for Cruz in the California primary, but it looked like the writing was on the wall. I don't know if that will happen a second time. I suspect it won't. So it opens up. And, you know, these primaries are weird. They're sequential. You build momentum, you lose momentum. You know, it's a weird little unpredictable game through Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina out of the gate. So we'll see.
You mean to say you're not with our friend and Lincoln alumnus Michael Knowles awaiting the glorious resurgency of the Chris Christie monarchy? That's not something you will have a lot of hope for. Right?
Yeah, Chris. Yeah. No.
Alas. I will say that, again, in the category of I'm here to be entertained, the Babylon Bee guys have been doing, or not the Babylon Bee guys, actually, like a few kind of other online wags have been sharing like different AI generated versions of Ron DeSantis puns. So like Ron DeMantis, and it's Ron DeSantis the praying mantis, and then just like Ron De Can't Miss, and it's Ron DeSantis as a baseball player. Anyway, this amuses me.
And the other interesting thing is I think the two home players, as it were, in South Carolina will be lucky to do third place or fourth place, which will be, and that is to say Nikki Haley and Tim Scott.
Oh, yeah.
You look, 3 months ago, Nikki Haley, I think, had just announced, or maybe she hadn't quite announced, and she's in her home state where she's a former 2-term governor. She's polling at in the single digits against Trump. DeSantis was sort of floating out there, so it's interesting. Just the further nationalization of our politics. It continues at quite a quick rate.
Absolutely, and that does make it at least more advisable for kind of also-rans to drop out as quickly as possible. One hopes that even a Nikki Haley can read the writing on the wall.
Yeah, at a certain point you just run out of money. I mean, and that will drive. Scott and Haley will stay in through South Carolina for obvious reasons, but they might quickly depart after that.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's time to talk about the real threat facing our nation. It's not debt default. It's not fascism in our democracy. It's the rise of white Latino supremacy. Excuse me, the rise of Latino white supremacy. It actually works both ways. But in this particular article, this New Yorker piece, this daily comment by Geraldo Hadava, it's the rise of Latino white supremacy. I don't know how many of our listeners are familiar with the infamous, at least infamous online article, which makes the claim that straight black men are the white people of black people. I always have to make sure I'm getting that right. But
that was from the great sort of black interest blog, The Root, right, Spencer?
Root. I think it is The Root or The Verge, maybe. Okay.
Yeah.
It's The Root. I'll take your word for it. And yes, it's a gift that keeps on giving because they keep writing the same article. And this is one that I wanted to talk about this one because there are actually some interesting racial politics going on here, some interesting positioning happening. The article itself is a disgusting screed as far as I'm concerned, and
poorly written to boot.
But poorly written, the author should be ashamed. I'm not that interested in kind of reiterating that fact since it's just so obviously a disgusting piece of trash. But just a few lines, so we got a flavor for this thing. Latino white supremacy isn't an oxymoron, and carrying out a premeditated mass shooting in the United States is one of the more American things a Latino could do. Here's another one. Scholars and journalists have described these Latino white supremacists in different ways. Some Latinos, they've argued, are also afflicted by aspirational whiteness, or the desire to be white in order to fit into the racial and capitalist order of the United States, to avoid the discrimination that Black Americans experience, or to justify the pursuit of individual wealth and belonging. This is obviously not a new argument. These sorts of vile insinuations have been made by the likes of Nicole Hannah-Jones, she of 1619 Project infamy, when I believe it was when DeSantis won a big victory. She took to Twitter to say, and one of her favorite things to do, which is to delete a tweet. She went onto Twitter and said something like, white people, certain Latinos are white and they indulge in white supremacy. This does speak to, I think, to put my cards on the table, I think that the reason this article and articles like it is appearing now would be because there's this growing Hispanic population in the US. The coalition of the ascendant is will not be televised, has not really delivered on leftward voting as advertised, especially in the case of people from Latin America who have, traditional faith, who might actually identify with kind of classic American values like hard work. And since that is in itself, according to the Smithsonian, an actual white supremacist value, the kind of line of attack for the woke left seems like it's going to be, oh, well, don't you worry about this massive and rapidly growing contingent of sort of vaguely off-white people who seem to be voting conservative, like they're actually white after all, or they're just trying to be white, or they're trying to be American, which means being a murderous psychopath. Does the appearance of this article signal to you guys any sort of broader trend? Am I reading too much into it? It seems as if there's some real wagon circling going on here.
The whole coalition of the ascendant, the whole coalition of the fringes is based around the flight from white and the idea that the real fracture in American politics will be between the white and the non-white.
Right.
And as many people as possible, presumably, are rushing to declare themselves as non-white, and this is the consensus, I guess, among the CRT crowd.
Yep.
But what would be interesting, and what I find kind of salutary, obviously, there's nothing salutary about any lunatic shooting people up, regardless of what kind of fantasy they have in their head about ethnopolitics.
Right.
Maybe the real fracture would be between Black and non-Black. Steve Saylor used to say, what we need to do, or we don't need to do, but just let the Democrat Party become defined as the Black Party. And let everyone else whose natural home has been the Democrat Party, once they learn that, oh, we're the junior partners in this coalition, meaning the Latinos, Asians, urban whites, women. Once they see that, look at all of the cities, Democrat cities, that are now run by Black electeds. Clearly, the Black segment of the Democrat Party is the dominant force in the party. They choose the leadership. Look at Biden and the whole weird and now South Carolina has been promoted to be the first primary,
right?
Because they're going to. Can you? I don't know much about it, but can you imagine how corrupt and dirty the South Carolina Democrats are? It's just. If you want to finagle a primary victory, how hard could that be in this state with a tiny Democrat minority or whatever? So it's interesting that in this effort to force a split between white and non-white, they might actually wind up creating a split between Black and non-Black. That you may actually see a non-Black definition becoming I don't know about dominant, but important, significant.
Right. That you're like that your sort of minority status is always going to be measured and evaluated by way of your proximity to blackness, and therefore there's sort of diminishing marginal returns in it for you if you're anything other than actually black to like get on board this trend.
And like if you look at the reparations polling,
right,
clearly blacks are pretty much in favor of getting reparations.
Okay, yeah.
Whites are pretty set against paying reparations. And Latinos and Asians seem to be a little bit more on board with it than whites.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's pretty preliminary at this point, right? I'd like to see how they feel when their taxes are quadrupled because, they're expected to pay out $4 million to each of their black neighbors.
And the wider lens on this one was jumping out at me in this article too, which is that Mike Gonzalez at Heritage and others have written about this, that the whole sort of Latino Hispanic categorization grew out of a concerted effort by NGOs like the Ford Foundation to manufacture this somewhat fake racial category and to have it identify with the same sort of historical narrative of oppression, or an analogous one anyway, as Black Americans had, and thus to have another solid, stalwart voting bloc for the Democratic Party. That has not exactly gone as planned, so I think that's the root or the source of a lot of this Latino white supremacy stuff. And you even saw it in between the lines in that poorly written short New Yorker piece, where it implied that, mass gun violence is very alarming. The United States is on the rise. And part of the thing driving it is Latinos buying too many guns because of some irrational fear brought about by recent years. And of course, the ethnic political backdrop of that is that a lot of Latinos bought guns in the summer of the George Floyd riots because they're in the closest proximity in the inner cities to dangerous fellow citizens who happen to be of a different race. And so, it's that article spoke volumes in between the lines, that was for sure. It also gave the stupid citation that, mass shootings are way, way up. There were 21 alone in Texas this year so far. It's technically true, but it's only if you count mass shootings as, 4+ shot, injured or killed. And a lot, if you look at the link and then look at all the reported crime stats, at least it wasn't scientific. I sort of poked around in the Texas ones. At least half of them were just normal run of the mill, bad neighborhood gang fights or, retribution of some various sorts. The normal, unfortunately, all too common violent part of the American inner city, whether it be in parts of Dallas or in Philadelphia or wherever.
Yeah. I mean, my sense with this stuff is always, Seth, that like these categories, and this is what Mike is always saying too, Ryan, like these categories aren't real one way or another. Like their referent is not actually a group of people of a certain race. Their referent is like a set of political concerns that is effectively totemized by a kind of voting bloc of a certain color or sexuality or sex or whatever. And so since none of them are real, like the whole thing is a game that the left is attempting to play of sort of dangling various aggrieved statuses in front of people in exchange for political obedience, in exchange for like, if you vote our way, like you will be afforded the status of Black, which is maybe the highest one, or like gay or trans or whatever. And then, of course, like infamously, Joe Biden comes out and says, like, if you don't vote for me, you ain't Black. If you're having trouble, if you're having trouble making your decision for president, you somehow are like exiled to the exterior darkness where like there is great whiteness and gnashing of teeth. And that like seems to be how all of this is working. I mean, personally, I would welcome the day that like Black people too like acknowledge that this is a raw deal, but it certainly seems easier to recognize if also, if your Latino status is also contingent on sort of having the right ideas, like not buying guns, all of these things that whatever they happen to want out of you right now. This always makes me a little bit hopeful when like this sort of stuff becomes so transparently cynical that it seems ready to backfire.
Well, like I didn't see it, but I gather that on The View, Joy Behar was explaining to everyone why Tim Scott and Clarence Thomas don't represent an authentic blackness.
Right.
They don't really speak to black people, or that they don't understand the black experience. Now, both of these men grew up. I gather Clarence Thomas didn't even grow up speaking English. He spoke Gullah, like a sort of a Creole or pidgin. Yeah. So, totally poor. But the idea that Joy Behar has basically said, no, I'm the real spokesperson for Black America. Right. Maybe she is.
Right.
From the perspective of like race as purely a socio-political construct, sure. Right. Let her be the one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that these categories are sold as sort of like identity markers in which you can root your sort of self and your soul. And in fact, they turn out to be just like totally empty signifiers that attach to whatever sort of like conformist views you wish to, like your sort of overlords wish you to adopt. Anyway, I just found that very interesting, and I find it telling that these sorts of articles are being published now, especially in the kind of moment when Ron DeSantis may or may not be the Republican nominee. Like his sort of success with Hispanic people is itself part and parcel of the phenomenon that is being papered over with Latino white supremacy.
I liked your phrase, Spencer, off-white supremacy. Made me think of taupe supremacy.
Beige supremacy.
This should be our response to a lot of this too, is just to mock it.
Oh my gosh.
Among all of our efforts to kind of debunk it and counter it, of course.
Yeah. Big fan of beige supremacy. Since we can all be categorized as some different form of beige, maybe we can have beige supremacy, and then everybody can get a piece of the supremacist pie. And with that absurdist note, we invite you, nay, implore you, nay, command you to read the damn site. This is our weekly segment in which we recommend a piece from the last week of articles on AmericanMind.org, which is a website that we edit. If you haven't been there, you should go. I would be shocked if you haven't been there and you're listening to my voice. But every now and then, I think there must be people who wander in from the wilds of podcasting libraries and discover us for the first time. Welcome. We're glad you're here. Now go read our damn site. My piece from this week is called AI and the Return of Creative Elitism. It's by Isaac Simpson. He of the very cool new advertising initiative, Will, W-I-L-L, and writer/host of The Carousel on Substack. If you know him on Twitter, he is Disgraced Propagandist, which is a great name for somebody that writes ad copy. This piece is about what AI can and cannot do in terms of generating creative language. Isaac makes the argument, which I heartily co-sign and endorse, and which we have been kind of chatting about together, that what AI really does is it reveals how much of the writing that's already out there could have been written by a machine. It's effectively, it forces us to kind of raise our awareness or sort of hone our taste and our senses for the sort of language that has been carefully hewn out of the like rock of human consciousness and experience, which is, I think, there's a reasonable case to be made that AI cannot produce that. And also, as Ted Chiang argues in the New Yorker, sort of can't produce that by virtue of what it is, by definition, it kind of takes the least common denominator or the median kind of bland word gunk that is just out there in the internet and reproduces it in sort of a plausible way. Isaac argues that this is a good thing because it will force actual creatives to distinguish themselves from the kind of bureaucratic functionaries that pass for creatives in much of modern American office culture. It's a great piece. Isaac is a really snappy writer, and you should check out his whole argument because he makes it beautifully. AI and the Return of Creative Elitism. Seth, what do you got?
I choose this week a piece by our own Mike Sabo, assistant editor for The American Mind. He has a new piece, which we just posted, called It's Not Just Going to End, subtitled Liberalism Will Not Go Quietly, in which Mike looks at the decades-long hope on the part of conservatives that liberalism and liberals have really done it this time, and they've really just gone too far, and surely any day now their whole movement is going to collapse and rupture and die of its internal contradictions, and yet somehow it keeps going. And he, rather astutely points out the many ways in which the liberal program is alive and well, racking up new victories, storming through the institutions, and it's going to take a lot more than wishful thinking on our part to make it go away. So I would check it out. It's Not Just Going to End by Mike Sabo.
The liberalism will continue until morale improves. Yes, that is a great piece
Right.
by Mike. Ryan, what do you got?
Well, I'm going to take so I'm a publisher of 2 publications, so I occasionally can cheat, especially when I didn't have time to peruse The American Mind enough. So I'm going to recommend a CRB essay live today. Is that right, Spencer? Was it today? Yesterday? Anyway.
Today, I believe.
Today. Called The Affirmative Action Regime by Jesse Merriam. I'll use it to cross-promote something as well, which is everyone should keep an eye out for the forthcoming Provocation, which is the pamphlet series out of the Center for the American Way of Life from Jesse Merriam on our anti-racist constitution. So the affirmative action essay is, we wanted someone to try to, offer a bit of a prelude to this decision, which will come down next month, right? Late next month, probably the last day of the term, on affirmative action, both at private universities and at public ones. The Harvard, forget the full name of the case, doesn't matter. Jesse used the occasion of that to sort of run through his taxonomy and genealogy of where we are today with affirmative action and post-1964 Civil Rights Act and jurisprudence and all the rest. The great inflection point predates the affirmative action cases. It's really the Brown v. Board decision. And it sort of created a new constitutional morality where the biggest evil would be discrimination and the greatest virtue would be sort of anti-racism and or affirmative action. They're kind of conflated in Jesse's opinion. Anyway, it's a somewhat heterodox take in which he predicts that this affirmative action case, it will not be the great victory that conservatives are hoping for. He just thinks there is too much institutional investment in this new regime, which we've now modified, but have been progressing through and adding to in fits and starts since the Bakke case at least, and then since the big inflection point Brown v. Board. And I should add a caveat, and Jesse would too, I think, which is to say that the moral momentum of that movement, however constitutionally flawed it may be, of course, is perfectly predictable given America's history with slavery. So it's not surprising that it's both a hard regime to criticize, and Jesse rolls through the experience of Bork and everyone else. I may be conflating the two pieces now, the essay and the provocation. Anyway, we should go get them both. But it's a thorny issue because unless we somehow restore the semblance of equal protection and true meritocracy, and that things are just going to get worse. And it's proven a very difficult regime to overturn and to even question it. I mean, it's full of word games. I mean, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a perfect example. How could anyone be against equity or inclusion? But it's freighted, these terms are freighted with 50 years of jurisprudence and a whole new way of understanding the rule of law and constitutionalism.
Man, nobody told me about dual citizenship privilege. I would have been tossing out CRB Rex this whole time. This is great.
It's my cheat. I don't do it that often because
yes.
It's just a quarterly. So
right, absolutely. And there's so much good stuff at American Mind that I would never need to simply resort to CRB. However, I will use this as an opportunity to plug our CRB podcast, which I also host. It's called The Close Read. I don't mention it that much on this show, but if you like the CRB, if you like this show, if you like anything Claremont does, you will probably enjoy the interviews that I do there with authors from the various essays of each new issue. In fact, I think I'm going to try to get Jesse Merriam on for this new round.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Now that we publish this new one.
The one that's out now is you and Michael Knowles, right? Talking about transgenderism.
It is. It's an enormous, delicious Ouroboros of self-referentiality, because Knowles reviewed my book for CRB.
Right.
So then I interviewed him about my review of my book for CRB. Our managing editor, John Kinker, sent me an email and said that now I should go on Knowles' show and be interviewed about the time I interviewed him about the review
of your book.
Yeah. So look out for that on the Michael Knowles show. But it's actually way less navel-gazing and self-referential than I just made it sound. You will like that episode and the show. With that, it is time once again for me to bid you farewell. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. It's such a delight to be virtually with you in this format. If you like this show, you should check out our websites at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, AmericanMind.org, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. We've talked about the products, I think, of each of those websites at some point on this podcast. There's lots more where that came from. And if you'd like to donate to support our work, we would be most grateful. You can do that at claremont.org/donate. It's how we keep the lights on. It's how we keep doing what we love and what we believe in and what we hope you will join us in fighting for. And with that, don't forget to give our show, the Roundtable, a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe. You can let people know about it. At the very least, at the bare minimum, if you have any criticisms whatsoever, you can sit quietly with them in silence and keep them to yourself. Thanks once again for listening. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon, Logan Zeppieri, and Blaze Ebener. And thank you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.